Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Libby. I am the grant director for the Rehab Counseling Program. This is being put on by the Rehab Counseling Program here at St. Cloud State. If you are in need of CEUs, please send us an email to rce@stcloudstate.edu, or you can drop your email down in chat and I will send you an email. As of right now, we are actually going to move forward with just doing free CEUs for anybody that attends that needs them through the CR for the CRC CEUs. Right now, we are not approved for the LPC. I'm going to turn this over. I'm just going to be moderating chats. Alex, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But my name is Michael Libby, the grant director. I'll be doing the moderating the chat. I am a white male, gray hats, yellow t-shirts, black glasses. Behind me is a bookshelf with some plants, some flags. Yeah, I turn over to you, Alex.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm a light-skinned person with kind of squarish glasses, gray hair. I'm trans-masculine, so I have short gray hair, wearing headphones. I have a short sleeve shirt on, which has got kind of flowers and skeletons in the colors of the trans flag, so white, pink, and blue. And behind me, there's some art from local artists on the wall, and a purple cabinet with like a rose quartz candle holder and a glass piece with red ribbon and a rainbow in the background. And the wall is gray behind me. And I'm about to kind of share my slides, and I will do my best to make sure that I read everything that's on the slide or tell you what's on the slides. But if at any point don't do that, please do let me know. All righty, so I'm just going to take a moment to share the slides and keep myself on track. And feel free to kind of ask questions as we go. And if it's something that I'm going to be addressing kind of later on, I'll let you know. And we'll also have a good chunk of time for questions at the end as well. I'll let you know a little bit more about my background before I get started as well. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm licensed both in Minnesota and Wisconsin. I was trained as a systemic psychotherapist in the UK, and then relicensed when I moved to this Dakota Anishinaabe land I'm on back in 2008. I'm also a somatic experiencing practitioner, and ASECT, which is the American Association for Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, certified sex therapist supervisor, AMFT, which is American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, approved supervisor, and I'm also a WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH certified gender specialist and mentor as well. I'm also a trans and queer person myself, who's been out for, I think as queer, we're getting close to 30 years now. And as trans for about 20 years. And so I've got my own lived experience as well as experience in working with gender, sexuality, and relationally diverse clients. So that's a little bit about me. Oh, and I also write books. And I have a book called Gender Trauma that's specifically on really addressing gender with a range of clients, including cisgender clients, from the perspective that a rigid gender binary is kind of part of the historical colonial trauma, and so as part of cultural and social and historical trauma, as well as being kind of played out in individual people's lives. And that book has won the ASECT Book Award for Sexuality Professionals, and the Nautilus Award too. My publisher will be happy that I remember to share that. I'm not very good with self-promotion, so, but they were like, remember to mention you got books when you present. So there you go, I've done my duty. So before we get started with content, I am a somatic provider as well as a family therapist. And so I always like to start from paying attention to our kind of body, minds, and our breath, and just take a moment to ground and connect to begin with. And so if this is not your jam, feel free to like look at your emails or go grab a glass of water or do what you need to do. But if you would like to, I'm just going to invite you to breathe. And I know we're breathing all the time, but we don't pay attention to our breath every time. And so just inviting you to be intentional with your breath. And with as much curiosity and as much self-compassion as you're able to in this moment, just notice what's happening when you slow down a little bit and pay attention to your breath and to your body, mind. Just notice how your breathing is. How are your muscles, tense, relaxed, neutral? It's just a moment to say hello to our body, mind, and slow down and see what's going on. And as you're breathing and kind of connecting with yourself, and if you want to, you can lower your gaze or close your eyes, but you don't have to. Just connecting the breath and noticing, not trying to change anything. And see if you need to kind of stretch or change your position on the chair to feel just a little bit more comfortable in this moment. And if so, this is a good time to do that. And as you're noticing your body, mind, see if you can notice that place where your body makes contact with the support underneath you, whether that's a chair, bed, couch, the floor. Just see if you can notice that you are held and supported by gravity on this good green earth. And see if you can relax into that support, even 5 or 10% more. And again, notice with as much curiosity and as much non-judgment as you're able to in this moment, how does it feel to really give into that support and feeling held by that support as you breathe? I'm going to invite you to take one more breath into your relationship with place, wherever you are. And so just kind of see if you can take a moment to either connect by putting your feet on the ground, for example, if they're not on the ground, or just imagining kind of your relationship and connection to the place you're on, the land you're on. And taking a moment to breathe into the relationship you're in with the land you're on, whether you are indigenous to the place you're on or whether you come to be to this place in other ways, and breathing into that complexity or simplicity of your relationship with place, and just breathing into that and noticing again what comes up for you when you do that. I'm going to invite you to take one more breath into the ancestral web. I know ancestors can be really complicated for many of us, and so they don't have to be ancestors of blood. They can be ancestors of spirit, activism, justice, healing, lineage, whichever ancestors feel supportive of this work in this moment. I know I'm going to be taking a breath into the support of gender-blessed ancestors, knowing that we're not the first to be doing this work, and hopefully we will not be the last. And I'm going to take one more breath into my hope that this work will be of benefit to you and all those who are touched by your work, and that they might benefit from this time we have together. And then take a moment to connect with the fact that even though you might be alone watching this webinar right now, you're actually in a Zoom room with other people, this magical technology that allows us to connect across time and space. And so in whatever way feels good, whether it feels good to look at kind of the number of participants who are here. If you want to kind of scroll, if you can, I don't know if participants are visible in the webinar mode or not, but if it feels good to kind of just breathe into that connection with other people in the room, just take a moment to do that. And then coming back to self, if your eyes have been closed, your gaze lowered, it's a good time to look around and notice what's in the environment around you. And I'm going to invite you to notice something that's pleasant, comforting, or neutral. It can be as simple as a glass of water. If you have a nice view out of a window, or a pleasing color on a fidget, whatever feels pleasant, comforting, or neutral. And take a moment to just notice that resource and know that you can come back to that resource at any point. And if you want to, you can also gently squeeze your arms, your hands, or brush down your arms and legs to kind of come back to the here and now and to this moment and to this place. And so whether it's kind of squeezing gently, patting lightly, or brushing down, whatever helps you kind of come back to the here and now in this room. Alrighty, and I saw that some people had questions about disease, but those have been addressed already. Yeah. Alrighty, so thank you for breathing with me for a moment. I feel it's really important to start from a grounded place when we talk about gender and sexuality, because there can be topics that kind of touch core parts of us for some of us, right? And so it feels helpful to me, at least as a presenter, to start from a slower pace. I think we're always so used to going fast, especially in the Zoom culture that we've been in for the last 3 years, where we go from meeting to meeting to meeting. So hopefully this has helped you be a little bit more present. I know it helps me be a little bit more present as well. All righty. So before we begin, a word about language. And also not knowing who was in the room, I've tried to really hit that balance between some introductory concepts, but also maybe some concepts that can be helpful to people who don't need as much of the one-on-one on this topic of affirming care with gender and sexuality diverse clients. And so a note about language, you're going to hear words like trans and cis and non-binary throughout the presentation. Trans is a Latin prefix that just means across from. And so when I'm talking about trans people, I'm using this as an umbrella term. I mean, they're all umbrella terms, but this is an umbrella term that really includes anybody whose gender identity does not align with their gender assigned at birth. So that would fall under the trans umbrella. Then cis, again, it's an umbrella term for anybody whose gender identity aligns with their gender assigned at birth. It's also a Latin prefix that means on the same side as. And non-binary, again, is an umbrella term for this vast landscapes of identities that might be not at all or not exclusive, masculine or feminine. So under the non-binary umbrella, there might be identities like agender, gender fluid, bigender, and so on. And of course, there are many other kind of gender identities, but those are kind of the three big buckets of language that I wanted to make sure that we were clear on before getting started. And talking about language, on this slide, you will see a Wordle that used to be really popular a few years ago with words like androgen, métis, transexuale, pafafin, aggressive, boy, mujeres, and so on. Those are all words that are used across the world, and in the corner, there are kind of different countries, you know, there's Italy, Australia, and I cannot remember all the countries that I've put on the slide. I think one of them is Brazil, and I've totally forgotten the other one. So sorry about that, but there's kind of pictures of different countries. And what I'm really trying to put across is that words like trans, cis, non-binary are also very much based in kind of Anglo culture and their English terms, and all across the globe and across time and space, that there have been and there are words that would, for identities that we would put under the trans or non-binary or gender expansive umbrellas in an English context. But I really wanted to take a moment to highlight that often we think of those as universal terms, but those are not universal terms. Those are just the terms that we use most of the time in English to talk about those gender identities. Alrighty, so let's start from talking a little bit about gender essentialism and why do I think it's important to talk about gender essentialism before even talking about affirming care. One of the reasons why I think it's really important is because it's such a pervasive framework in psychology and counseling. So on this slide, there are kind of two heads. One is pink, one is blue, and they're the symbols. You know, the circle with the plus sign facing downward in the pink head, and the circle with the arrow facing up and to the right for the blue head. And gender essentialism is really pervasive in psychology and mental health because we often have testing, for example, that is normed in a gender binary way. You know, it's normed against cis men and women. Usually it's also mostly normed with white population, with younger populations. And so there's a lot of implicit bias in the field of psychology, counseling, and mental health that I really wanted to highlight. And gender essentialism is really this idea that the genitals that we are born with and the sexual characteristics that we're born with map clearly on a gender. And then that mapping on the gender identity also maps onto personality characteristics or aptitudes that might be different between genders. And gender essentialism is a facet of biological determinism. So this idea that our biology determines certain traits, and hopefully you know kind of how problematic biological determinism is. And I think there's been a lot of critique about biological determinism being, you know, colonial, racist, white supremacist, and I would add cisgenderist, because gender essentialism is this facet of biological determinism. And when I say cisgenderist, it's not about the individual identity, it's about the ideology that is also pervasive in our world that looks at kind of cis people, so people whose gender identity aligns with their gender assigned at birth, as being baseline, right? And everybody else deviates from that. And so again, I wanted to make it clear that that is actually not a given. That is very much part of this gender essentialist framework. And the gender essentialist framework doesn't just impact trans, non-binary, and/or gender diverse people. I truly believe it impacts everyone. And as I said in the title of the slide, gender essentialism impacts everyone. And on this slide, there's like a poster where there's an image of somebody with kind of short shaved hair and half of their bodies in a dress and half of their bodies in a t-shirt and pants, which is a problematic image. And the poster is still a little binary. You know, things that are on the poster are for every girl who's tired of acting weak when she's strong. There is a boy tired of appearing strong when he feels vulnerable. For every boy who's burdened with the constant expectation of knowing everything, there's a girl tired of people not trusting her intelligence, and so on. So it's still very binary, but it really highlights how gender essentialism really constricts us when it comes to gender roles, not just identity. And so even people who are cisgender are impacted by gender essentialism because it's a restrictive framework. It expects us to be in a certain box. And of course, the box is also dependent on social and cultural factors, and it might be bigger or smaller, and historical factors too, but it still kind of puts us in a certain box. Some boxes can be a little bit more spacious, and some boxes might be tighter, but it's still a box that it puts us in according to our gender. And then on the slide is also this man card. There is a picture of a gentleman with a very bushy beard and a good head of hair. And it says men card, punch, each task is achieved in the middle. And then around there's things like grow an epic beard, learn to weld, hike the Appalachian Trail solo, rebuild an engine, any engine, you know, and so on. And again, it is a little maybe exaggerated and sarcastic, but it's again making that point that gender essentialism doesn't just impact trans, non-binary, and or gender expansive people, but it really impacts all of us in different way, of course. And also that it's not just about gender usually, it's also about gender and how we're racialized, whether we're classed as disabled or not, our socioeconomic status, how we're classed, and so on. All of those things kind of contribute to how gender is viewed both on a cultural and social context and the individual experiences of gender, if that makes sense. And if there are any questions to clarify anything I'm saying, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'm trying to keep an eye as much as possible. So why am I talking about gender essentialism in, you know, when we're really talking about counseling and therapy that is affirming? Well, I'm talking about gender essentialism and mental health because gender is actually, from a public health perspective, a key determinant of health, including mental health. And what that means is that there are some key differences in kind of our health status when it comes to gender. And so, for example, rates of depression, suicidality, stress levels, violence, both experiencing or perpetrating, sexualization and trauma do kind of fall along different gender lines. And again, not just gender, but also the intersection of gender, race, class, disability, immigrant status, indigenous status, all of those things, right? And one thing that we see consistently across minoritized population, and I say minoritized because it's not necessarily about being numerically a minority. In fact, people don't even have to be numerically a minority to be minoritized. But minoritized means being minoritized by the systems of power and privilege and oppression that we're all immersed in. And so it is important to talk about gender essentialism because in a way it impacts our mental health collectively. And so, for example, gendered expectations around masculinity, you know, in a white Anglo context, in what we currently call the United States in 2023, there is an expectation, for example, that most masculine folks, most men, are not going to be as fluent in talking about emotions. They're not going to be as forthcoming in talking about emotions. They're less likely to seek healthcare, including mental health care. And so that is going to kind of impact their health. But the impact is not because there are characteristics that are essential to their gender identity, is because we live in such a gender essentialist world that it puts us in a box even from before we're born. right? Often when people are pregnant, one of the first questions that people are asked is it a girl or a boy? This baby hasn't even come into the world yet, and we're already thinking about their gender. And as somebody who has been a gestational parent, I remember being asked, is it a girl or a boy when I was pregnant? And I was like, I think it's a human, really hoping for a baby hippo, because I love hippos, but I think it's a human, which really confused a lot of people, my sarcasm on that one. But I was really trying to make the point of it's going to be a human baby. And that is all we know at this point. We might even know what their genitals are, but that doesn't really tell us anything about the gender identity of this child, right? As it turned out, both my bio kid and my child who came into my life later when he was already 6 years old are cisgender so far. And I say so far because gender can also be fluid across the lifespan, right? But the more we constrict gender into rigid boxes, the more we see those kind of higher rates, for example, for trans, non-binary, and or gender expansive people of depression, suicidality, stress, substance use, experiencing violence, being overly sexualized, trauma, and so on. And again, the people who are most impacted within trans, non-binary, and or gender expansive community tend to be trans feminine people of color because of the intersection of gender, misogyny, racism, trans misogyny, and for example, for Black trans feminine people, the specific impact of trans misogynoir, for example. I see there's something in the chat. Oh, yeah, it's just Michael reminding you that if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we can answer them directly or at the end of the presentation. And the fact that gender is a key determinant of health is not just true for trans, non-binary, and or gender expansive people, it's also true for cis people. We know, for example, that in the US, Black gestational parents are at a much higher risk of dying during childbirth. Black women are less likely to be recognized if they're having cardiac issues. Black folks in general are seen as being able to withstand more pain, which again is that biological determinist approach, which is really racist and very ingrained in the field of mental health. And so when we talk about gender being a key determinant of mental health, we're not just talking about trans, non-binary, and or gender expansive people. We're really talking about everybody. Gender has an impact on all of our mental health, no matter what our gender identity. And of course, it has different impact depending on our positionality. Sorry, I need to drink a lot of water when I'm presenting because my mouth gets very dry very quickly. Alrighty, so that's gender. We're talking about both gender and sexuality for this presentation. I'm kind of ambitiously trying to talk about kind of how to provide the best care and be the most respectful counselor or therapist you can be when working with all gender identities and all sexualities. And so I want to take a moment to talk about sexuality before then going on to really thinking about, and sexuality and mental health, before thinking about how to challenge some of those binaries. Also I want to talk about the current socio-political situation and how that impacts our role as counselors and therapists. But back to sexuality. So we talked about gender essentialism and how pervasive it is in psychology and mental health. And in sexuality, there's also very much of a pervasive binary, which is the binary of straight or gay. And so there's a picture on the slide that has the words straight, gay, written in kind of red LED lights. And there are purple arrows, the straight arrow points in one direction, the gay arrow underneath the word gay points in the opposite direction. And that's very much the pervasive kind of framework in psychology and mental health. There are not a lot of models, for example, that take into account bisexuality or pansexuality or fluid sexuality, or a lot of models that account for people being in multiple relationships. I remember when I was training, I was very excited that we would have our first workshop with somebody who worked with LGBTQIA plus families and couples, and they was going to present this more inclusive family therapy model. And the model didn't allow for bisexuality at all. And I remember asking, like, what about bisexuality? And his answer was, well, just go with whatever relationship you're in. So if you're in an opposite gender relationship, you would follow the kind of straight trajectory. And if you're in a same gender relationship, you follow, the gay and lesbian trajectory. And I was like, well, I'm not just bisexual, I'm also polyamorous. And so it's not that simple. Also, I have a sexual identity, not my relationships. And at that point, the presenter was just like, well, then this model doesn't apply. And I think that we see that a lot in psychology and mental health, that there are models that are created according to fairly rigid gender binaries and sexuality binaries. And then anybody who doesn't fit into those models is seen as, well, you're challenging and difficult, and you just don't fit into those models, rather than really thinking about how so many of our models of gender and sexuality are actually really restrictive. And luckily, in the last few years, we've had kind of new theories of sexuality. And the one that I really want to lift up is sexual configurations theory by Professor Sari Van Anders. And what I really like about her sexual configuration theory is that it really questions all of those binaries, and it really creates a model and a theory of sexuality that is inclusive of all our different gender and sexualities, including asexuality, including solo sexuality versus partner sexuality, and so on. And that could take like the whole hour just talking about that model. So I just wanted to mention it. And as far as I know, Sari's model of sexual configuration theory was the first theoretical model of human sexuality that was not just based on reproductive capacity. Most of our past theories of human sexuality are very much based on reproduction and are very much based on gender essentialist ideas and binary ideas of sexuality. But actually, sexuality is much more complex than just being straight or gay. It's also, we could break down sexuality further into, attraction, who we are attracted to, desire, who do we fantasize about, behavior, how do we act, and of course, identity. And not all those things align on one another. For example, for some people, they might not experience sexual attraction at all, for example, or they might only experience sexual attractions after they have an emotional connection with somebody, but they might or might not experience sexual desire or romantic desire. For some people, they might identify as straight, but they might engage in sexual acts with people of the same gender, for example. And so when we break down sexuality, it's not just about identities, but it's also about all these other aspects of kind of our attractions, desire, and behaviors when it comes to sexuality. And so much more complex than that. And again, it's also about the intersection of gender and sexuality, race and sexuality, class and sexuality, disability and sexuality, and so on. And I know that in the series, you've got a lot on disability and sexuality, which was very excited to see, because that's usually a really neglected area. So I know there'll be other presenters that really speak to those issues, whereas I'm keeping it much more generic in some ways. So I've been talking a lot about those binaries and how those binaries are kind of harmful in some ways, but what is the alternative? If gender and sexuality are so complex, how can we do justice to that complexity? And, I have a quote from one of the books that I co-authored with Dr. Meg John Barker. And in Life's Non-Binary, one of the things we say is, if we wanted to capture the complexity of our sexuality, we'd have to plot it on multiple dimensions. not just the dimension of the genders we are attracted to, we'd also need our locations on those dimensions to be able to move over time for the aspects of our sexuality which are fluid rather than static. Most of us are likely to remain in a pretty similar place on some dimensions while moving around on others. And we wrote Life Isn't Binary actually before Sari, I believe, published the sexual configuration theory, and then soon after we kind of partnered up with Sari to make the theory more accessible by creating a zine that is available in a multiplicity of languages now. But really, I like this quote because it conveys this idea that to really do justice to this complexity, we need to be so much more fluid and so much more open to fluidity than most training in counseling, therapy, or psychology really teaches us to, if that makes sense. Usually we're kind of taught in a pretty kind of binary way. And often even when we're talking about genders and sexuality and relational orientations that don't fall under the cis hetero mononormative paradigm, that paradigm is still very dominant, I think, in our field. And so if we're thinking about sexuality in this much more complex way, fluid way, we also really need to pay attention to all the different intersections and also how our positionality in terms of social location, but also cultural locations impacts our sexuality. And in How to Understand Your Sexuality, which is the most recent book by John Barker and I, one of the things that we do is we have multiple experiences, which are kind of composite vignettes of people expressing different experiences. So this is not any one specific person, but it's kind of a composite vignette. So for example, in this one, somebody says, for a long time, I felt I couldn't talk about my sexual desires. I felt so ashamed of wanting to be tied up, humiliated, and more. As a straight woman, I felt I was letting down feminists everywhere. It was only after finding community that I started to feel a little more comfortable in myself. However, there are still desires that I would only share with people in kink communities and not elsewhere. And so this is an example of how, you know, sexuality is more complex, and even somebody who is straight in terms of their sexuality might have a more complex desires in kink community that kind of in some ways locate them then outside that normative paradigm, right? And also the fact that some kink desires are okay if they're in service to kind of mononormativity, but they're not okay if they're not in service to reproducing the same system of relationships and sexuality, if that makes sense. And then I have another example for sexuality and the impact of culture and positionality. As a Black man, I struggled my whole life with my absence of sexual desire. It's just assumed that you'll be hypersexual and always up for it. But I was never interested. It was a big relief to find ace community, and then my ace BIPOC community within that, who really got it. They helped support me to bring my sexual practice in line with my actual desires, rather than feeling like I had to be sexual or that there was something wrong with me. So again, this kind of really points out that intersection of gender, race, and sexuality, right? Often in our kind of Anglo-dominant white supremacist culture in North America, especially Black men are hypersexualized. I think that all Black folks actually are hypersexualized, and people of color generally, but Black men are hypersexualized in specific ways. And so if you don't fall into that paradigm, what does that mean for your identity? And even if you know that that paradigm is informed by racism and white supremacy and colonialism, it doesn't mean that you're not impacted by it, right? In a way, it's like cisgenderism, transphobia, queerphobia, acephobia are like the air that we breathe. It gets into our lungs, and sometimes we don't even know it's there until we realize, oh, why am I struggling so much with this aspect of my identity or my experience? It's because I'm so impacted by all those ideas that are in the social cultural environment that it impacts my sense of self and therefore my mental health. So hopefully those examples give you a little bit of an idea of things that impact our sense of self when it comes to sexuality. And then when we think about mental health, you know, just like gender kind of impacts our mental health, so does sexuality. And I saw that there was a question also about how long the meeting is. And my understanding is that I have an hour to present, and then we'll have half an hour for questions. But you can, of course, also ask questions while I'm presenting. So I'll be presenting for about 20-ish more minutes, and then there'll be more Q&A. So hopefully that helps. And it's being recorded. So you can always, if you have to leave early, you can always watch it later, I believe. So in terms of sexuality and mental health, what are some of the things that impact people, especially when their sexuality doesn't align with kind of cis hetero mononormative expectations? And so things like the pressure to conform, right? We've seen it in the couple of previous examples. What does it mean if you don't conform, right? If you kind of steer away or float away from normative expectations of sexuality. There can also be the impact of lack of or limited sex education. A lot of sex education is not really inclusive of all sexuality. Most sex education does not necessarily cover queer sexuality. It often doesn't cover asexuality or kinks or anything like that. And especially for folks, for example, who are queer and disabled, or trans and or queer and disabled, there's even less sex education. And again, that could be its own kind of webinar, but we know that there's kind of a lack of or limited sex education because ableism, which I'm sure other presenters will touch on during the series. Religiosity can also have an impact if you are brought up in a religion where there are certain expectations around sexuality, whether it's around the when to have your sexual debut. So are you expected to have your sexual debut within marriage or outside of marriage? Or whether it's if your identity is accepted within your religion or spirituality or not. And so again, if anybody kind of moves away from those expectations, that can be a real impact on mental health, a real dissonance between the religiosity that we kind of been brought up in, and then our identity or our attractions or desires or behaviors. And that, of course, can bring up a lot of shame. Actually, had a mentee who just finished their doctoral studies around trans and queer people dealing with shame due to religiosity and the religious trauma. And it was really interesting because a lot of trans and or queer people do experience trauma in highly religious environments that are not inclusive. And of course, some religious and spiritual environments are inclusive, but many of them are not. And so that can really bring up shame in a big way. And we know the shame really behaves like trauma in the body. And so people are going to have a lot of fight, flight, or freeze or fawn reactions when they're dealing with shame around their sexualities, whether it's their identities, attraction, behaviors, or desires. And of course, family also has a role in terms of family of origin. You know, if our family of origin doesn't really accept our sexuality in some ways, that can be a real challenge for people's mental health, because we do need to have a sense of belonging, right? And if there is this idea that our main caregivers are supposed to give us unconditional love, and then the love suddenly becomes conditional, that can be really impactful on people's mental health. And especially for those folks who come out younger or who just cannot hide who they are because it's just more visible for some people than it is for others. That kind of family rejection potentially can have a huge impact on mental health. And then, of course, the impact of invisibility and erasure, especially for sexuality that fall outside of the clear, neat binary of straight or gay, right? We see, for example, that bi-pan or, you know, fluid kind of sexualities, folks who fall into the bi-plus category, let's call it, experience higher level, for example, of depression, suicidality, substance use, because they experience that minoritized status both within straight communities and within queer communities. And so that invisibility and erasure of some sexuality, whether it's bi+ sexuality, folks who are asexual, kinky folks, and so on. So how can we challenge gender and sexuality binaries for better mental health in our work, right? So the last kind of part of this, it's really more about tools and a little bit about the current social landscape and some information about gender affirming care, because I think there's a lot of noise and misconceptions around that at the moment. So one way of challenging gender and sexuality binaries for better mental health is to really get more comfortable with uncertainty and fluidity, both ourselves as counselors and therapists, and supporting our clients in being more comfortable with embracing fluidity and accepting uncertainty. And I really feel that if we cannot do that for ourselves as therapists or counselors, it's really hard for us to do it with our clients, right? And that means really expanding into ourselves. Are we comfortable with our own genders and sexualities, right? Do we feel expansion around our gender and sexual identities, or do we feel restriction, right? And that expansiveness, I think it's really necessary, at least the inner expansiveness, because I understand that it's not always safe for us to be out and visible in the world. If we're trans, non-binary, gender expansive, or queer in some ways, but at least if we can feel that internal expansion and support that expansion and embracing of fluidity and accepting of uncertainty in our clients can be really helpful. Community, connecting with others is really helpful for mental health, especially for minoritized folks when it comes to gender and sexuality. And also really understanding that there are many different ways of being intimate with people. So there are many types of intimacy. Sexual intimacy is just one type of intimacy, but there is also conflict intimacy, access intimacy, aesthetic intimacy, and I could go on, but again, that could be its own thing. But I think that in order to challenge those kind of binaries that have a negative impact on people's mental health, we also need to get comfortable with the idea that there are many different ways of experiencing intimacy, many different types of intimacy, and that we don't just have intimacy with one person, even if we're monogamous, right? We can also have a certain level of intimacy with our work colleagues, right? Sometimes people say work wife or work husband, for example, if they work really closely with somebody because they spend so much time together. Or if you're an organizer, you might have an intimacy that comes from a shared political commitment to the same values. And finally, I think that one of the things that really also helps people come into better mental health if they belong to minoritized communities when it comes to gender and sexuality, it's also really viewing eroticism as power and presence. So not just eroticism as something that's just sexual, but as aliveness in the way that Audre Lorde talks about kind of eroticism as kind of our capacity to be alive, our capacity to feel agency, and our capacity to be present in the world, in the here and now, and in relation to the world around us. And in some ways, I feel that that is one thing that is perceived as a threat by dominant culture. Just yesterday, I was talking to an acquaintance for Gender Stories podcast, and we were talking about the power of trans people and why so many trans people are getting targeted. We might not have systemic power, but that eroticism as power and present really challenges the status quo, right? If there is this whole group of people who can be creative and can say, look, actually, we don't have to stick with the gender assigned at birth, right? We can be ourselves. We can go beyond those cultural norms that are actually pretty recent, and they're very white, they're very colonial. And again, that could be a whole other topic of conversations. But if we can do that, what other norms can we challenge, right? And if we think about kind of conservatism and fascism, more specifically as control and bodily control and control of body autonomy, any declaration of body autonomy when it comes to gender and sexuality, then it's a threat to conservatism and fascist forces that are usually about or colonial ideas of body control. So body autonomy pulls in the completely opposite direction, and trans, non-binary, gender expansive people, queer people remind the world that we can have body autonomy. And that body autonomy, that eroticism can feel like a threat sometimes to certain sociopolitical forces. And so when we embrace ourselves, we also embrace our power. And this is a quote from Audre Lorde in the uses of the erotic essay, which is really foundational, I think, if you're working with anybody, but I think especially working with queer folks. And so the quote that I'm using on the slide is this is one reason why the erotic is so feared and so often relegated to the bedroom alone when it is recognized at all. For once, we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives. We begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of. So basically, Audre is saying, for once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, right? Once we have that presence, that power, that connectedness, really that's when we start to feel what we're really capable of, right? Our agency. And the quote continues, our erotic knowledge empowers us, becomes a lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate those aspects honestly in terms of their relative meaning within our lives. And this is a grave responsibility projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe. We have been raised to fear the yes within ourselves, our deepest cravings. And so, in uses of the erotic, really it is this kind of celebration of erotic as aliveness and power, and not just as being about sexuality. And I really wanted to use this quote because I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about working in an affirmative way with gender and sexuality, we are not just talking about inclusion or acceptance, we're really talking about changing the paradigm, changing the dominant cultural social paradigm. And very few authors have talked about that as beautifully, I think, as Audre Lorde has. That's why I really wanted to include this quote. And if you have not read Uses of the Erotic, I really encourage you to read it. At the moment, we also have another challenge when we work with diverse gender and sexualities, which is the challenge of what's happening socially. And so at the moment, especially when it comes to youth, I think the social landscape is not great. There's really an uprising of TERF narratives, so trans exclusionary radical feminist narratives in the US. I think they started in the UK, but we're seeing them sip in the United States as well as in Canada and other countries. And that has an impact on people's mental health. If you wake up every day and you're on social media or you see the news and there's kind of a lot of transphobia, that's going to impact our mental health, especially for our younger folks. And also there's so much more access to social media, and that's a kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, I think people, including young people and their families, have a lot more access to language to know their identities. And on the other, there's also a lot of exposure to hate and exclusionary narratives and so on. And so that has an impact on our sense of well-being and our mental health. And so there is this exposure to transphobic media narratives. There's this pressure from a lot of peers for families, including extended families, educators and healthcare providers, so on, to not be supportive of trans and queer youth. And there is a lot of sensationalizing and sexualizing of trans and queer identities. And I think that has often been true, but it's highlighted, I think, on social media. And there's pictures of somebody holding their phone and it says Instagram. There's the YouTube logo and the Good Morning America logo on the slide, as well as the bullet points that I've just gone through. And another really problematic thing that has happened in 2017 was the introduction of this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I want to touch on it lightly because there is so much misinformation about gender affirming care. So I'll move through this quickly, but I want people to be aware of this information. So rapid onset gender dysphoria is a theory that's been widely discredited by all professional association as not being founded in good research, not being methodologically sound, or not even being theoretically sound. But this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria has really put across this thought that there is a social contagion at the moment. So on the slide, there is the paper that Lisa Littleman kind of had to revise because it was so poor methodologically and questionable, with a revised kind of written in on a red line. Then there is the WPATH position on rapid onset gender dysphoria with ROG stamped on that position. And then there's a picture of a young, light-skinned, blue-eyed person with blue hair who looks kind of feminine by wearing a shirt and a bow tie. And then it says, all the cool girls are transitioning, an epidemic of teenage gender confusion, with a microphone underneath. And that really summarizes a lot of what we're seeing playing out in the political arena at the moment. So this idea that there is a social contagion, or that gender affirming care is about not questioning young people at all. And so I wanted to spend the last few minutes really clarifying what is actually happening. So in terms of gender affirming care, this is from a handout by the Office of the Secretary for Health. Gender affirming care is a supportive form of healthcare. It consists of an array of services that may include medical, surgical, mental health, and non-medical services for transgender and non-binary people. For transgender and non-binary children and adolescents, early gender affirming care is crucial to overall health and well-being, as it allows the child or adolescent to focus on social transitions and can increase their confidence while navigating the healthcare system. So this is like just the definition of it, but what does that mean? And I know we're almost at time, but I think it's important to go through the last few slides. So I'll do my best to kind of move through them quickly, but not too quickly. So when it comes to kind of gender affirming care, first of all, we need to understand that there are many paths and possibilities, right? There is psychological, so how we understand ourselves, the psychological path, the social path, right? Do we want to change our name or our pronouns, the way we present to the world? There's a legal pathway. We want to change our name legally, our gender marker legally, and so on. And then there's the medical pathways, which might include puberty suppression, cross-sex hormones, or body modifications in any of those combinations. And some people go down all of those paths, and some people only go down certain paths. And so when we're talking about gender affirming care, we're never talking about just one thing, and we're never talking just about medical transition or body modification alone. And I think that's important to mention, because the standards of care, which are the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Standards of Care at the moment, have changed a lot over time. So if we look at them from 1979 all the way to version 8, there have been a lot of changes. So in 2012 we saw some of the major changes in version 7. So it's only been 11 years since gender identity as a spectrum has been recognized by this association. And it's only been 11 years since freedom of gender expression, regardless of identity, has also been recognized as valid, and multiple treatment options being recognized as valid. Before, it was very much a to Z linear pathway. And, in 2012, so only 11 years ago, it was really when there was this realization that not every trans person has to go from A to Z for their pathway to be valid. And it's only been 11 years since psychotherapy is recommended, but not required for medical intervention, although assessment from a licensed mental health provider is still required. And again, it's only been 11 years since conversion therapy has been condemned for adults. Therapies aimed at changing an adult's gender identity were no longer considered ethical. And for children, that change only happened in the last few months. In 2022, when the standards of care version 8 were released, we see a lot of changes. We see young people being included. We see this global organization supporting a potential earlier start of some interventions. We see an explicit inclusion of non-binary identities, a distinction between the treatment of children and that of adolescents, because they have different needs, the importance of parental or caregiver involvement, especially for youth, but really for everybody. And then, collaborative and supportive biopsychosocial assessment. So I'm not just going through, the mental health therapist to the endocrinologist, but really having a collaborative approach. And it's only been a few months since we've had a clear statement against reparative or conversion therapy at any age from WPATH. And the last kind of difference in this area that I want to highlight before our conclusion are also that not only in my own career as a therapist so far, we've gone from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, but now we are going from dysphoria to incongruence. So ICD, which is the Internal Classification of Diseases that's run by the World Health Organization, now talks about gender incongruence. And this is no longer under the mental health umbrella, is actually under the sexual health umbrella. And the other major change is that distress is no longer a criteria. So as long as there is a misalignment between somebody's gender identity and their gender assigned at birth, that's enough to be diagnosed with gender incongruence. And so in a way, it really takes away this need for us trans folks to perform pain and distress in the service of cisgender comfort. So we can be ourselves, embrace ourselves, and be recognized for who we are if we want to access kind of medical care. So I've thrown a lot of information at you. I know a couple of you might have had to go because you probably had at 1 o'clock, but I want to kind of summarize some ideas for how to best provide, kind of integrate those ideas into practice, right? So what can we do? So a few ideas to get us started are really try to increase your awareness. If you have gender and sexuality privilege, be able to recognize that privilege. If you're having challenges with using different pronouns, practice using those pronouns away from the people impacted. So for example, when you play a board game, practice using different pronouns if that's a good way to do it, or use different pronouns for your animal companions. Animals really, by and large, don't care about their pronouns, I found. So that's a good way of practicing if you need to. And practice away from the people who are going to be impacted if you are having challenges with using pronouns that you are not used to, like neopronouns, for example. Be accountable if you misgender somebody, just apologize and move on, or for any micro or macroaggressions that relate to somebody's gender and or sexuality. And one of the ways in which we can avoid some of those micro or macroaggressions is really by practicing not assuming people's gender and their sexual identities, not making assumptions about their identities, and also not revoking gender privilege if you find somebody's trans. So for example, you've been using she, her pronouns for your colleague, and then you found out she's trans, and all of a sudden you start using they pronouns or even another pronoun. Then that's what it means to revoke gender privilege. A few more ideas. So that was awareness, knowledge, learn, listen, and find out more about other people's experiences. You can do that through listening to podcasts, reading books and memoirs. You don't have to just learn In fact, we don't want to just learn from our clients' experiences. We want to learn from a broader range of sources and be mindful of tokenizing or seeking approval or forgiveness from minoritized folks. And really, in order to do that, it's important to nurture meaningful relationships with people of all genders and sexualities. A few more ideas around skills this time, normalize not assuming gender and sexuality. And that means using inclusive language all the time, not just when you think that there is somebody who's trans or queer or might be present in the room. Be aware of misgendering, especially when there's power dynamics involved. So if you're somebody's counselor or therapist and somebody's your client, that's a power dynamic. If somebody's your supervisor or your student. Be an advocate without becoming a cis and or straight savior. And that means following the lead of trans and or queer advocates whenever possible and uplifting trans and queer voices, and challenge transphobia and queerphobia within yourself as well as the environment around you. Like I said, it's like the air that we breathe, and we do need to challenge that. So affirming care in action, in conclusion, is really about being responsive to multiple and also, I would say, fluid identities, expressions, roles, and experiences. Affirming care in action is systemic and collaborative. So, for example, collaborating with community members like spiritual or religious leader, schools, obviously with the consent of your clients, but that kind of systemic collaborative approach rather than that one-on-one approach. Affirming care also fosters autonomy and authenticity, both within ourselves and our clients, facilitates connection within the family, whether it's family of origin or family of choice or both, enhances resilience, not just on the individual level, but on a family and community level. It nurtures community building, and it leverages client strengths. It also advocates for the reduction of systemic barriers. So it's not just about what happens in the therapy room, but also what we advocate for in the larger community. And it's really important for us to be able to provide affirming care to use reflexivity. So both individual and relational. So have the capacity to both reflect on our own practice, our own values, our own skills, our own beliefs, but also to do that relationally with our colleagues and with our clients. And if you are here and you're trans, non-binary, gender expansive, and or queer in some way, this can also have impacted you in other ways compared to folks who might be cisgender. And so just a reminder to connect with community if you can, and take care of yourself, because it can be a lot to share identities with the communities that you work with as well. And on the slide, there is a picture of the trans flag, and superimposed there are some hands that are connecting at the wrist, like a circle. And then there's a picture of a person in a brown skinned person with a hijab and a yellow hoodie, a skirt, and some leggings and boots, and a cat on their lap. And then it says, taking care of myself includes my body, my feelings, my loved ones, my thoughts, my gender. So thank you very much. On this last slide, it just says thank you in a lot of languages, including my first language. So grazie mille. And my contact details, which are alex@alexiantaffi.com. My website is alexiantaffi.com, and I can be found on social media at XTAFFI, Xtaffi. I'm very easy to reach. Sometimes I take a while to respond to emails, but I really try to respond to everybody. So feel free to kind of follow up with some questions if there's something that you don't feel you can ask in front of others. And now, without further ado, because I've already gone 8 minutes over, I'm gonna open it up to questions and conversation. So Michael, I don't know if there's some questions, or if people want to think about questions, or if you have questions.
I don't see anything popping up. I love your work.
Thank you.
In the process of going through what is the latest book I have yours, it's on gender trauma. And as being submitted as a white cisgendered male, I predominantly work currently with queer folk. And that's part of the reason for this training is when Governor Walz did the ban on conversion therapy. It's like, okay, now we need to make our communities a little bit better. And that is the goal for this.
Thank you. Yeah, so I know that sometimes it can be hard to ask questions, but just take a minute. And if you have a question, there are no questions that are too simple or they're bad questions. I truly believe that. So, you know, I think you can even submit your question anonymously with this format. So if you want to do that, I believe you can do that. So feel free to really, this is your time to ask anything, right? We have another 20 minutes for questions. I mean, I can keep talking for another 20 minutes, but I would much rather answer your questions. I'm going to give people a moment to think about it. And, you know, as you're thinking about it, like, what are the challenges you are encountering when, you know, working with the gender, sexuality, relational, diverse clients? Okay, I see a question. Excellent. As a practicing therapist, how to address gender and sexuality issues where the DSM-5 may be lacking? How do you bring in other resources? And is this greatly stigmatized? I think I understand the question. And if I don't, please add more to your question or put something in the chat if you can access the chat. Yeah, I think that the DSM-5 is indeed not only lacking, but it's pathologizing, right? And one of the things that often people, oh, and if you would like to answer this question live, Michael, can people do that? Because that might be a little easier.
Yeah, if they want to come on live, I can bring them in so they can respond.
I think that'd be great because I want to make sure I'm responding to the right question.
Let me message them and make sure they're comfortable. I know this person.
Yeah, because, okay. So, oh, I thought I saw they wanted to come on live. If they do, that's great. If not, that's okay. If I got that wrong, I'm sorry. So the DSM, you know, often we're not even taught in grad school that it's very much something that's driven by the publishers of the DSM, and experts are invited whenever there is a change in the DSM. So it's not like the World Health Organization, when there's a change in ICD, there's a call out to all the experts to kind of give their feedback. The DSM process is much more closed off and driven by a medicalized model. And so I think it's actually really insufficient to address a lot of the needs that our clients have. But yeah, if you want to add more kind of live, go for it to your question.
Let's see here. I guess my video isn't showing up, but I can still talk.
Yeah, I can hear you. Go for it.
Well, it kind of seemed like you answered it. I'd like to hear more about some of those other resources, and if you face any challenges with people saying, oh, you can't do that, you have to follow it to the T, you can't do that, you know, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. Yes, I think definitely, you know, I like to use resources that are not kind of based in a medical model. And so often I use a lot of community-based resources. Sometimes I feel like I've had to create my own resources. That's kind of how a lot of the books were born, right? We didn't really have anything for clients that was very introductory about sexuality, for example, which is why we wrote How to Understand Your Sexuality. And I've been told many times in my life that I couldn't do things all the time, in fact. But whether that's true or not, right? That's I think that's where my neurodivergence helped me. You know, my natural tendency to question authority because of being autistic and ADHD. And so partially for me, I've always asked myself, is this person telling me I can't do that because that's how they were trained or what they believe? And is this actually factually true, right? And what I mean by that is, for example, people are like, well, we have to bill insurance. It has to be gender identity disorder still, because that's what it says in the ICD-10. And I actually asked her, we work with a local company that's an electronic health records, Breezy. And because of that, having that relationship, I was like, hey, I know that this is what it says in the ICD-10, but can we use the same code, F64, I believe, and put gender dysphoria? And they were like, we can do that and see what happens with insurance. We did that. We've had zero problem with insurance with that code. And so people are telling me we have to use this. And I was like, no, we just have to use the code. The folks in insurance and folks at the ICD know there's gender dysphoria, right? So it's just one example. Or when I used to work for a large gender identity clinic, I was told these are the measures you have to use, right? And some of them I was okay with it, but some of the measures I felt were harmful. And because I was licensed, I was like, I am not going to use these 3 measures because I think they're directly harmful to young people. And there was pushback, and they said, you have to. And I said, actually, ethically, I don't. I'm a licensed provider. I was like, if you want to pursue this in a disciplinary action, you can, but I'm a licensed provider. And part of my ethical duty is not to harm my clients. They didn't pursue anything because actually that is a sound argument. We have ethics, you know, and if my ethics tell me this is going to be harmful, and having worked with a lot of clients that were harmed by that medicalized approach and by some harmful measures, I knew how important it was not to keep perpetuating that trauma that a lot of young people that were screened through that process had experienced. And so, yeah, I've been told a lot of times in my life, you can do that. And my follow-up question to myself is always, can I not do that? Or you don't want me to do that? Or you don't like me to do that, right? Because those are all very different things. And maybe that's me getting into semantics, right? But somebody saying you can't, do they mean you can't, or do they mean I don't like it if you're going to do that, right? And if it's just that they don't like it, well, that's too bad, right? But sometimes, you know, we also have to ask ourselves, what am I willing to sacrifice for my values as a therapist, if that makes sense?
Yeah,
And
that makes sense.
Right. And I feel like as long as I stay within the ethical requirements of my profession and I have integrity and transparency, I think there is space for pushback on the stigmatizing, pathologizing model. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, and I think I kind of had another one, but I'm wondering if any others had questions.
Oh, somebody just asked if there was an interpreter the whole time. And yes, I've seen the interpreter work very hard throughout the presentation. Yes, they've been here the whole time. I don't see other questions. So if you have any other questions, go for it. If people are thinking about it, this is a good time to put your question.
Well, part of
there.
part of the reason I'm so interested in the DSM is because my long-term career goal is to become a therapist. And so I was wondering if gender fluidity is even in there, or is it still very binary?
That's a great question. I think that there was a change from DSM 4 and 5. So there's been a change where there has been a mild recognition of fluidity, but not really as much. I think the biggest change is the ICD. I honestly am still confused why we keep using the DSM for teaching people, given that most of the world uses the ICD and we use the ICD to bill insurance. You know, so that's a good question to ask ourselves as a field, like what is even the role of this document, right? And also remember that the DSM gives us criteria that are pretty broad sometimes. So some of it also depends on our interpretation of those criteria. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
For example, DSM-4 really had confusing criteria for children, and some of the old research on trans kids and on desistance, right? Kids changing their mind was because children were being misdiagnosed. Anybody who had a non-gender normative behavior was ending up with this gender identity diagnosis at the time that was incorrect because the criteria were not accurate. And there was a lot of interpreting some of this criteria as, oh, any kid, you know, that does things that are not normative could fall under this diagnosis. But actually, you know, we need to understand that behavior and identity are two different things. And a kid behaving in a gender non-conforming way is not the same as a kid saying, I'm a boy or I'm a girl. Does that make sense? And so we really need to use a lot of our own critical faculties when we engage with the DSM. And it is not the, you know, that's just one model. I often say to my clients, you know, diagnoses are just the portal that we need to walk through for you to get the services you need. And I never believe that somebody is their diagnosis. And I'm very explicit with my clients around that.
It was interesting. I didn't realize how much more the ICD was used.
Mm-hmm. It's actually, that's what you're going to use if you bill insurance. At the moment in the US, we're still using ICD-10 because the US usually is several years behind many other countries in adopting the new ICD. But yeah, I
Thank
know
you.
that's something that often people learn in their internship or practicums, because again, it's not even mentioned sometimes. Mm-hmm.
Thanks again.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Any other questions? We got another 10 minutes and I'm very happy to answer questions, and folks are still here. So you probably have some questions. Don't be shy. It's okay.
I just to follow up what you're saying, Alex, I'm new to the field. I just graduated here in May, and I stayed on with my internship site. And I really like the work that they do, and working with some adolescents. And we had a recent adolescent that parents brought him in because they said that there were some cultural implications there. They grew up in the Middle East, and the thoughts and the patterns that were in the child's head that they were going to die and go to hell if they transitioned into a boy. Well, to find out that it wasn't gender dysphoria, it was more of identity itself and wanting to be respected because the cultural impacts that were at play, and within the community, the gender itself played a large role in respect.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting to be able to navigate, and the father would get down to their level and have communication in their eyes and treat them with respect. But it's
that's a great example. Congratulations also on graduating, by the way. But I think that's a great example of why, you know, there is so much misunderstanding about gender affirming care. But gender affirming care ultimately is about all gender identities and expression being valid and legitimate, right? And that's a beautiful example of working with a young person and being very aware of their cultural heritage and the impact of that and the community, right? And the importance of distinguishing between identity and expression or behavior, or even just like, you know, saying I'm a girl is different than saying I want to have access to what girls have access to, or I want to dress in a certain way, right? And vice versa. And I think that is important for us to distinguish all of this so that we can best support our clients wherever they're at and wherever they want to be at.
absolutely. So I know just by looking at the chat, we have multiple students in here. And part of my role is I recruit and work with the university to help process grant funding for individuals that work in voc rehab.
Mhm.
We have students that are outside of Minnesota, some in Montana, Seattle, New York. I mean, it's all over the United States. What would you tell somebody that is growing up in or working in a community that doesn't accept gender identity?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially right now, because I believe this has been the worst year for anti-trans legislation being introduced across the state. I think we're at over 500 at this point, anti-trans bills being introduced across various states. Yes, that's a hard question. I would say make sure you have community around you. You know, there are people who are organizing in those states where there is kind of pushback and anti-trans legislation. There are therapists who are connecting therapists, who are creating networks of support and peer support groups. And if you don't have access to that, email me, because I can introduce you to some of those folks who are doing that kind of organizing in Nebraska, Texas, and Florida and other states. And so connect with your colleagues. And unfortunately, you're coming into the field at a time where you might have to ask yourself, like, how far am I willing to go to being consistent with my values, and that I feel very fortunate to be in Minnesota and not to have to ask myself, would I be willing to lose my license for working in a way that's congruent with my values? Some of my colleagues don't have that privilege. I've talked even with colleagues who are thinking about giving up their license so that they can keep doing the work they're doing as coaches, but not be ruled by the state because they're in a state that has a lot of anti-trans laws, for example. And that's heartbreaking, honestly, that we're seeing. And I'm talking people who have like 20 years of experience also, not somebody new in the field, should I get my license or not? There's literally people with a lot of experience who mostly work with trans and queer folks who are considering giving up their license or moving or figuring out what, or having to consult with lawyers about what are my options if I don't follow those transphobic laws. For example, the ones that might require a therapist to disclose to a parent a child gender or sexual identity, even though it might be harmful to that child. Yeah, those are not, I don't know if that answers your questions, but those are not easy situations to be in. And so I would say connection and clarity as well with yourself. And know that it's also, it's okay for you, if you have a license and you want to keep your license, find where that line is, right? How far can I push that line? And then, okay, here it is. And so how do I then support myself by being connected with colleagues, being connected with my professional association? Hopefully you're part of a professional association that is supportive. And if not on the state level, most national professional associations have been really condemning of all this anti-trans legislation. So that's a good way also to connect. Yeah. Any last questions for our last few minutes together? Either from you, Michael, because the students who are here, or from people, from the students themselves or other folks.
Not seeing anything.
That's okay.
I really appreciate you for coming. And we did a lot of research into this to find effective speakers. And you're definitely on the top of the list.
Thank you.
We wanted to find a way to give individuals within the queer community and or people with disabilities that platform back that other communities are pulling away.
Yeah, I really appreciate how thoughtful and intentional you've been in putting this series on, because I was looking at all the other speakers and I was like, this is great. And it helped me think, okay, I don't have to cover everything. There are other people who are going to cover other pieces. And if I will also send you a handout of further reading, if it's helpful for people, so that if folks want to follow up with some more resources, I can share those.
That'd be great. Because I have all their emails, I can send everything out in a mass email.
That's great. And if there are questions that people felt they want to ask in front of other people, do feel free to reach out by email. Like I said, it might take me a minute or a month, sometimes depending on the month, to answer your email, but I'll get to it. And so feel free to reach out to me. I'll send those resources to Michael as well. And I hope that this was a worthwhile use of your time today. I really appreciated you having me here. Thank you. All righty. Should we wrap up?